Fredericksburg, Texas, September 1945. The barn stood at the edge of the Mueller property, weathered wood silvered by decades of sun and wind. Inside, 2 German women lay on hay bales covered with clean linens, their labor pains echoing off the rafters. The war had ended 3 months earlier, but these prisoners remained, stranded in enemy territory, their bodies creating new life in a place that had every reason to hate them. When Hilda Schmidt, the town's midwife, walked through that barn door, carrying her medical bag, the watching guards expected her to do the minimum required by regulation. What she did instead would fracture the town's understanding of who deserved mercy. The story begins not in Texas, but in North Africa, where the war had transformed women into soldiers and soldiers into prisoners. By 1943, the German regime had mobilized every available person for the war effort, including women who served as radio operators, mechanics, nurses, and administrative personnel in occupied territories. Lieutenant Marguerite Fischer had been stationed in Tunis, managing communications for a supply depot when the Allied forces swept through. She was 24 years old, a trained telegraph operator from Hamburg who de-volunteered because her 2 brothers had already fallen on the Eastern Front and her family needed the military stipend. She expected to spend the war behind a desk, translating coded messages, never seeing combat. The capture happened at dawn on May 7, 1943. British forces surrounded the depot before anyone inside understood the defensive lines had collapsed. Marguerite and 17 other German women walked out with their hands raised, blinking in the bright African sun, trying to comprehend that they were now prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention had provisions for female prisoners, but the infrastructure didn't exist yet. The Allies hadn't anticipated capturing significant numbers of German women this early in the campaign. Temporary arrangements were made, converted warehouses, hastily organized transports, guards who'd received no training in managing female POWs. Marguerite spent 6 weeks in North Africa before being shipped to a processing facility in England, and finally across the Atlantic to the United States. The journey took 2 months. By the time she arrived at the port in New York, she was 3 months pregnant. The father was another German prisoner, a supply sergeant she'd known for 8 days before their capture. His name was Klaus Reinhardt. They'd spent one night together in the chaos before Tunis fell, 2 people seeking comfort in the face of probable death. She didn't know if he'd survived the war. She never learned his fate. Corporal Anna Vogel's story followed a different trajectory. She'd been a nurse attached to the Afrika Korps, captured near El Alamein in late 1942. She was 29 years old, pragmatic and unshakable, the kind of woman who delivered babies in field hospitals while artillery shells landed, close enough to shake dust from the ceiling beams. Anna had been 4 months pregnant when captured. The father was a German medical officer who'd been sent east to the Russian front 3 weeks before she discovered her condition. She'd written him letters that never reached their destination. The mail system had collapsed along with everything else. Both women ended up at Camp Swift in Texas by summer 1944, assigned to a small women's POW facility that housed 23 German female nurses, radio operators, administrative personnel, all captured in North Africa or Sicily. The camp was understaffed and undersupplied, operated more like a detention center than a traditional POW facility. The pregnancies were documented, medical care provided minimally. Army regulations required basic health care for pregnant prisoners, but the bureaucracy moved slowly, forms circulating between offices, while the women's bodies changed with inevitable biology. By summer 1945, both women were approaching their due dates. Marguerite was due in early September, Anna in late August. The camp's medical officer, Captain Robert Hayes, had no training in obstetrics. The nearest military hospital with proper maternity facilities was 60 miles away in San Antonio. Hayes requested a transfer for both women to the hospital facility. The paperwork was filed in July. By mid-August, no response had arrived. He filed again, marked urgent. Still nothing. The military government was overwhelmed with demobilization, repatriation of millions of soldiers, processing of war crimes investigations. 2 pregnant German POWs in Texas ranked low on anyone's priority list. On August 28th, Anna went into labor. The camp didn't have proper facilities for childbirth. Hayes improvised cleared a storage room, brought in cots, sterilized instruments as best he could with boiling water and alcohol. But complications arose quickly. Anna's blood pressure spiked dangerously. The baby was breech. Hayes knew enough to understand he was in over his head. He made a decision that would later be debated in military hearings and town council meetings for months. He called for civilian help. Fredericksburg was 4 miles from Camp Swift, a small town of maybe 3,000 people, heavily German in ancestry. Most families had immigrated in the 1840s, fleeing failed revolutions and seeking farmland in Texas. They'd kept their language, their traditions, their Lutheran churches. But after Pearl Harbor, speaking German in public became dangerous. Businesses with German names had been vandalized. Young men with German surnames joined the military in disproportionate numbers to prove their loyalty. The town had a complicated relationship with the POW camp. Some residents worked there as civilian contractors. Others refused to acknowledge its existence. The prisoners were enemy combatants, but they were also German-speaking women, and in a town where grandmothers still sang lullabies in Bavarian dialect, the cognitive dissonance was profound. Hilda Schmidt was the town's primary midwife. She was 58 years old, had delivered over 400 babies in her career, and had emigrated from Bavaria herself as a young woman in 1910. She spoke flawless English, but still prayed in German. Her own son was serving in the Pacific Theater. Her nephew had died at Normandy. When Captain Hayes called her, explained the situation, a breech baby, a POW in danger, medical facilities too far away, she didn't hesitate. Yes, she said, I'm coming. Her husband objected. These were enemy soldiers. German women who'd served the regime that had started the war, that had brought death to thousands of American boys. Why should she risk legal complications, community judgment, to help them? Hilda looked at him with an expression he'd seen before, usually when she was about to deliver a difficult truth. They're women giving birth, she said. That comes before everything else. She packed her medical bag, the same leather satchel she'd carried for 30 years, worn smooth by handling, containing forceps, scissors, cord ties, herbal preparations for hemorrhage control. She drove her Ford pickup the 4 miles to Camp Swift in the late afternoon, dust billowing behind her tires. The guards at the gate didn't want to let her through. Civilians required advance authorization, paperwork, security clearances. Hayes had to come personally to vouch for her, and even then, the gate sergeant made calls to verify before allowing entry. By the time she reached the storage room converted to birthing facility, Anna had been in labor for 9 hours. The contractions were strong but ineffective. The baby hadn't descended. Anna's face was gray with exhaustion and fear. Hilda set down her bag and rolled up her sleeves. She spoke to Anna in German, not the formal German of officials, but the comfortable Bavarian dialect of home, of mothers and grandmothers, of kitchens and gardens. How long between contractions? She asked. Anna stared at her, disbelieving. An American speaking German like home. A civilian choosing to be here. 4 minutes, Anna whispered. Maybe 5 now. Hilda examined her, quick and professional, hands gentle despite the clinical necessity. Breech presentation, as Hayes had diagnosed, but not hopeless. She'd turned breech babies before, though it required skill, strength, and luck in equal measure. I'm going to try to turn the baby, Hilda said. It will hurt. But if we don't, you'll need surgery, and that means transport. And right now, that seems unlikely. Anna nodded. Do what you must. What followed was a procedure called external cephalic version, manipulating the baby from outside the womb, attempting to rotate it into proper position for birth. Hilda's hands pressed against Anna's swollen abdomen, feeling for the baby's position, applying carefully calibrated pressure. Anna screamed. The sound echoed off the storage room walls, raw and desperate. Hayes stood by, helpless, watching this civilian midwife do what his medical training hadn't prepared him for. Slowly, with patient persistence, Hilda coaxed the baby into turning. Millimeter by millimeter, the small body rotated inside the womb. It took 20 minutes that felt like hours. When it was done, Hilda's hands were trembling and Anna was sobbing with relief. "Now we wait," Hilda said. "The baby will come when ready." 3 hours later, at 11 o'clock on a humid August night, Anna Vogel delivered a healthy baby girl in a storage room at Camp Swift, Texas. Hilda caught the infant, cleared her airways, tied and cut the cord with practiced efficiency. The baby cried strong lungs, good color, approximately 7 pounds. Anna held her daughter for the first time, tears streaming down her face, speaking in German to a child born in enemy territory. She named her Emma, after her own mother back in Bremen, who might not even know she had a granddaughter. Hilda stayed through the night, monitoring for complications, teaching Anna how to nurse, ensuring both mother and child were stable. At dawn, exhausted but satisfied, she packed her bag to leave. Anna caught her hand. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you help me?" Hilda looked at this young woman, enemy soldier, prisoner, mother. She thought about her own son, somewhere in the Pacific, hoping that if he were wounded, someone would show mercy. She thought about her nephew, who'd never come home. She thought about the complexity of living in a world where doing the right thing wasn't always simple. Because babies don't choose where they're born, Hilda said, and women don't choose when they go into labor. Everything else is just politics. Word spread through Fredericksburg faster than Hilda had anticipated. By the time she returned home, her husband had already fielded 3 phone calls, 2 from neighbors concerned about her involvement with enemy prisoners, 1 from the Lutheran pastor wanting to discuss the theological implications of mercy toward enemies. The town divided cleanly. Half the population saw Hilda's actions as Christian charity, the extension of medical care regardless of circumstances. The other half saw it as collaboration, helping the enemy, potentially undermining the war effort, even though the war had already ended. The county newspaper ran an article. Local midwife delivers enemy prisoners' baby community debates. Propriety of aid to German captive. The tone was carefully neutral, but the letters to the editor that followed were anything but. One veteran wrote, "My brother died on Omaha Beach fighting Germans. Why should we help German women have babies in our own country?" Another responded, "The baby didn't invade France. Punishing infants for their parents' wars is exactly what we fought against." The debate raged through September, fierce and emotional, touching on every raw nerve in a community still processing the war's trauma. Church congregations split over it. Family dinners became arguments. The VFW Hall held a special meeting to discuss whether Hilda should be censured. And then Marguerite Fisher went into labor. It happened on September 12th, 2 weeks after Anna's delivery. Marguerite's contractions started at dawn, regular and strong. Hayes called Hilda immediately. This time, there was no debate in her mind. She drove to Camp Swift without hesitation. But this time, she wasn't alone. 3 other women from Fredericksburg came with her. Clara Mueller, who owned the barn where the title of this story originates. Martha Richter, another midwife who'd been quietly supporting Hilda through the community backlash. And Elizabeth Hartman, a young woman whose husband was still overseas, who believed that helping others was the best way to honor those who'd served. They arrived at Camp Swift to find Hayes had made arrangements. The storage room was still functioning as a makeshift maternity ward, but it was cramped, unsuitable for multiple births in sequence. Clara had offered her barn larger, better ventilated, more private. Hayes made the decision to transport both Anna and Marguerite to the Mueller property under guard. It was irregular, possibly violated protocols, but he was tired of regulations that prioritized paperwork over people. 2 military guards accompanied them, rifles present but pointed at the ground. Clara's barn had been cleaned and prepared. Fresh hay in the loft, clean linen spread over hay bales to create makeshift beds, buckets of hot water, lanterns hung from the rafters. It looked like something from a Renaissance nativity scene, pastoral and timeless, completely divorced from the modern war that had brought these women to this place. Marguerite's labor progressed steadily through the morning. Unlike Anna's complicated delivery, this one followed the normal pattern: contraction strengthening, cervix dilating, baby descending. By noon, Hilda could feel the baby's head crowning. The barn door opened. More women from Fredericksburg had arrived, bringing food, blankets, baby clothes. Word had spread that the birth was happening, and something had shifted in the town's consciousness. Whatever their opinions about helping enemy prisoners, the sight of a woman in labor bypassed political positions and accessed something more fundamental. Martha Richter took over heating water. Elizabeth Hartman organized the supplies. Other women whose names weren't recorded in official documents came and went, bringing what they could, staying as long as permitted, bearing witness to something they couldn't fully articulate but recognized as important. At 1:47 p.m., Marguerite Fisher delivered a healthy baby boy in Clara Meller's barn. Hilda caught him, cleared his airways, placed him on his mother's chest. He had Marguerite's dark hair and his absent father's strong jawline. She named him Thomas, after St. Thomas who doubted until he saw. The women of Fredericksburg stood in that barn, German-American civilians and German POW prisoners, guards with rifles and midwives with clean towels, and watched a baby take his first breath in a place that somehow existed outside the war's binary divisions. Clara Mueller, whose barn had become an accidental sanctuary, spoke first. Her voice was quiet but carried in the stillness. "I've been angry for 4 years," she said. "Angry at Germany for starting the war. Angry at the world for taking my son into danger. But looking at these babies, they're just babies. They didn't start anything. And if we can't separate innocent children from the crimes of governments, then what exactly were we fighting for?" No one answered. The question hung in the air like the dust motes dancing in the barn's sunlight, profound and unanswerable and absolutely necessary. The aftermath unfolded slowly, like ripples spreading across still water. Both women recovered well, though they remained in POW custody. The babies thrived under the Women's collective care, American civilians and German prisoners working together to ensure proper nutrition, medical attention, basic supplies. The military finally processed the paperwork for repatriation in November 1945. Anna and Marguerite, along with their infants, were scheduled for transport to Europe, to Germany, to whatever remained of their former lives. The Reich had collapsed completely. Cities lay in ruins. The occupation governments were still establishing basic order. Going back meant facing an uncertain future in a devastated country. But staying wasn't an option. They were enemy aliens, prisoners of war. When peace officially concluded, they had to be returned. The day before their departure, Hilda visited them one final time. She brought gifts, baby clothes, blankets, photographs she'd taken of Emma and Thomas. She'd developed the film herself, printed copies to ensure these women would have something to remember. Marguerite held the photograph of her son, studying it as if trying to memorize every detail. "I don't know what we're going back to," she said. "Hamburg was bombed. My family, I haven't heard from them in a year." Hilda sat beside her on the cot, this enemy prisoner who'd become something more complicated than simple categories allowed. "You'll survive," Hilda said. "You've survived this. You'll find a way forward." Anna, nursing Emma nearby, spoke without looking up. "Why did you help us?" she asked. The same question she'd asked before, but with different weight now, laden with months of reflection. Hilda considered her answer carefully. "Because when I look at you, I don't see enemy soldiers," she finally said. "I see women who got caught in history's machinery. Because my mother came from Bavaria, and she spoke like you speak, and she taught me that mercy isn't conditional on nationality. Because my son is somewhere in the Pacific, and I hope if he needs help, someone will give it regardless of politics." She paused, then continued. "And because these babies are innocent. Whatever we think about the war, about Germany, about anything that happened, these children are innocent. And protecting innocent children is the only thing that actually matters in the end." The transport departed on November 18, 1945. Anna and Marguerite, along with Emma and Thomas, boarded a truck that would take them to the port for the first stage of their journey home. Hilda and several other women from Fredericksburg came to witness their departure. The farewell was brief. Military schedules didn't allow for prolonged goodbyes. But in those final moments, something passed between the women, a recognition that transcended language or nationality, an understanding forged in the intimate intensity of birth and survival. Marguerite handed Hilda a letter before boarding. "Don't read it now," she said. "Wait." The truck pulled away, disappeared down the dusty road toward an uncertain future. Hilda stood watching until the dust settled, then opened the letter. It was written in careful English, clearly composed over multiple drafts. "Dear Mrs. Schmidt, I don't have adequate words in either language to express what your kindness has meant. You saw us as human when that would have been easier not to. You helped us when you had every reason to refuse. You gave our children a chance at life when the world seemed determined to punish them for existing. I hope Thomas grows up in a world that remembers women like you people, who choose mercy when hatred would be simpler, who see individuals when propaganda demands they see only enemies. If he asks someday about where he was born, I will tell him about Texas, about a barn that smelled of hay, and lantern oil, about American women who crossed every line to help German prisoners give birth safely. I will tell him that humanity persists even in war's worst moments, that kindness survives even when everything else collapses. Thank you for my son's life. Thank you for mine. Thank you for proving that some things matter more than victory or defeat. With gratitude I cannot adequately express. Marguerite Fisher." Hilda folded the letter carefully, placed it in her Bible, carried it with her for the rest of her life. Years later, her grandchildren would find it after her death, read it, and finally understand why their grandmother had been so controversial in Fredericksburg during those final months of the war. The debate in Fredericksburg didn't end with the women's departure. If anything, it intensified. The community remained divided about whether Hilda's actions had been appropriate, whether helping enemy, prisoners, even pregnant ones, constituted a betrayal of American soldiers who died fighting Germany. The county newspaper continued publishing letters on both sides. The veterans' organizations held meetings. The churches preached sermons about mercy and justice, each interpreting the situation through their theological frameworks. But something had shifted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the conversation changed from "should we have helped them?" to "what does it mean that we did?" Captain Hayes received an official reprimand for allowing civilian involvement in POW medical care without proper authorization. It was a mild censure, noting protocol violations, but acknowledging the practical necessities of the situation. His military career wasn't damaged. If anything, his superiors seemed relieved the situation had resolved without serious complications. Clara Muller's barn became something of a local landmark. People would drive past, point it out, tell the story, sometimes with approval, sometimes with disapproval, always with a sense that something significant had happened there. Hilda continued her midwife practice. Some families refused to use her services anymore, uncomfortable with her decision to help enemy prisoners. Others sought her out specifically because of it, believing that a midwife who'd extended care to enemies would certainly provide good care to friends. She delivered another 200 babies before retiring in 1962. At her retirement party, someone asked if she regretted helping the German posts, given all the controversy it had caused. Hilda looked around the room at faces she'd known for decades, at young mothers whose babies she'd caught, at grandchildren and great-grandchildren, born into a world that had somehow survived its worst impulses. "Not for 1 second," she said. "Those babies are 17 years old now, somewhere in Germany, hopefully healthy, hopefully happy. Everything else is just noise." The historical record loses track of Anna Vogel and Marguerite Fischer after their return to Germany. Repatriation records show they arrived in Bremerhaven in December 1945, were processed through civilian registration, then disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany, where millions of displaced persons were trying to rebuild lives from ruins. But fragments remain. A 1987 letter arrived at the Fredericksburg Historical Society, forwarded from a dozen previous addresses, sent by someone identifying herself as Emma Vogel. She was 42 years old, living in Bremen, a nurse like her mother. She'd found old documents among her mother's belongings after Anna died, letters, photographs, a birth certificate from Camp Swift, Texas. "My mother spoke about Texas sometimes," Emma wrote, "about a barn that smelled like hay, about American women who helped her when she had no right to expect help. She taught me that kindness isn't patriotic or political, it's just human. And humans who forget that become something less than human, regardless of which side they fight for." She included a photograph. Anna in her 60s, gray-haired but smiling, surrounded by grandchildren. On the back, in English, "Texas gave me life. Thank you." Thomas Fisher's trail is harder to follow. German records from the immediate post-war period are incomplete, complicated by the division of Germany and the Cold War that followed. But a 1992 inquiry to the American Embassy in Berlin mentioned a Thomas Fisher, born September 1945, in Texas to a German POW who had become a teacher in Hamburg, specializing in international relations and conflict resolution. "My mother told me about my birth," he wrote in his inquiry, "about women who crossed lines to help her. I've spent my life trying to understand why humans build walls between each other and how we learn to climb over them. My birth story is my earliest lesson in that complexity." He never visited Texas. By the time he made contact, both Hilda Schmidt and Clara Mueller had passed away. But he sent money to establish a small plaque at the Mueller property, not memorializing the birth itself, but commemorating what it represented. The plaque, installed in 1993, reads simply, "In this barn, September 1945, human mercy transcended human conflict. May we remember always that children are innocent, mothers are universal, and kindness is not weakened by boundaries." Hilda Schmidt died in 1973 at age 86. Her obituary in the Fredericksburg paper made no mention of the controversy that had surrounded her in 1945. It focused on the 600 babies she'd delivered, the generations of families she'd served, the decades of dedication to her community. But at her funeral, her son returned safely from the Pacific. Now a father and grandfather himself told the story. He explained what his mother had done, why she'd done it, what it had cost her, and what it had taught him. "She never apologized for helping those women," he said. "She believed that some things transcend politics. That mercy isn't conditional. That if you have the skills to help someone giving birth, you help them, period. Everything else is just excuses." He pulled out the letter from Marguerite Fisher, yellowed and creased from decades in his mother's Bible. He read it aloud to a church full of people, some of whom still remembered the controversy, most of whom had only heard stories. When he finished, the church was silent. Then, slowly, someone began to clap, and another. Then the whole congregation, rising to their feet, applauding a woman who'd chosen compassion over convenience, mercy over politics, humanity over hatred. The barn still stands on the Mueller property, though it's used for storage now. sheltering tractors instead of new life. The wooden beams are weathered, the roof replaced twice, the hay long since cleared away. But the space remains, holding its memories in silence. Sometimes tourists visit, having read about the incident in regional history books or documentaries about POW camps in Texas. They stand in the doorway, trying to imagine it, lanterns hanging from rafters, women in labor on hay bales, civilians and prisoners working together to bring children safely into a world that had no place for them yet. The story resonates differently with each generation. To those who lived through the war, it was controversial, challenging simple narratives about friends and enemies. To their children, raised in relative peace, it became a parable about transcending hatred. To their grandchildren, navigating a complex globalized world, it offers a reminder that humanity exists independent of nationality. The historical significance isn't that babies were born in a barn. That's happened throughout human history. The significance is what that moment represented. A crack in the binary thinking that wars require a space where enemy and ally became meaningless categories, compared to the immediate reality of women giving birth and other women choosing to help. Hilda Schmidt made a choice that September Day in 1945. She chose to see pregnant women instead of enemy soldiers, babies instead of German children, humans instead of categories. That choice cost her nothing material, but everything social community standing, simple friendships, the comfort of clear moral boundaries. And yet, 78 years later, her choice echoes forward. Because Emma became a nurse who carried her mother's lesson into her work. Because Thomas became a teacher who built his career on understanding conflict resolution. Because a barn in Texas became a symbol of something larger than itself. The question the story poses isn't whether Hilda was right or wrong. That debate died with the generation that lived through it. The question is whether we're capable of making similar choices when our own moment arrives, when our own clear categories get complicated by human reality, when our own convenient hatreds face the challenge of individual mercy. Wars create enemies. Earth creates mothers. Babies create needs that transcend politics. Midwives create life regardless of whose life it is. And sometimes, in a barn in Texas on a September afternoon, all those truths collide and remind us that humanity persists even when everything else argues against it. That's what shocked the county in 1945. Not that babies were born. That's biology. But that Americans chose to help Germans, that enemies became people, that mercy won out over hatred, when hatred would have been easier, more justifiable, more socially acceptable. The shock was that kindness survived the war intact, that some things like helping a woman give birth matter more than victory or defeat, that babies don't choose their parents' countries, that mothers in labor transcend nationality, that mercy, when offered genuinely, transforms everyone involved. Hilda Schmidt walked into a barn carrying a medical bag. She walked out having redefined what it means to be human in wartime. The babies she delivered that month lived, grew, had children of their own. And somewhere in Germany, in families that might not even know the full story, her kindness echoes forward through generations. Proof that a single choice made with courage in a moment of need can defeat hatred more completely than any weapon ever forged. That's what happened in a barn in Texas in September 1945. That's what still matters today.